Hey guys, welcome to this week's Q&A. We have 3 amazing questions for today. Let's do it. So we have question number 1. How do I mix lead vocal doubles? Very good question. To me, the philosophy is that the lead vocal should always stand up front and everything else should be behind it. So if there are 2 lead vocals and they're meant to be together and a bit panned apart, then of course I'll use the same settings. I'll just copy paste it, pan them apart a little bit, and that's it. But if it's a lead vocal with a double that is just meant to support it, then the approach is a little bit different. What I usually do is I copy paste the settings over, but I reduce the higher mids a little bit so that the lead vocal is more present than the double. And I'll use a faster attack on the compressor that I'm using and a slower release. Because a faster attack and a slower release will push the vocal more in the background so that the 2 vocals are a bit more distinct. So if I have a lead vocal, I let's say use a medium attack fast release compressor, that will make the vocal stand really nicely up front. And then on the double, I will use a fast attack and a slower release, which will push the vocal a bit more behind. This works really well, and with the tonal difference, you can then still hear some distinction between the 2 vocals. Effects-wise, I'll make sure that the lead vocal has all the effects that I want to be really audible, so my echoes, my reverbs will be mostly on this lead vocal. And on the double, I'll make sure I have no echoes, because I don't want that to interfere with the lead vocal effect. But I will use some of the reverb to make sure that it sits nicely behind the lead. Sometimes if this double is only meant for support to thicken up the lead, I'll leave it completely dry and just blend it into taste so that it supports the lead vocal tastefully. So what I want to avoid is that this double vocal interferes with the original lead. So I'll do everything I can to make it a little bit less significant. So a bit less treble, a bit less bass, to make it a bit smaller compared to the lead that is meant to be the hero of the song. Question number 2. How do I mix backing vocals? Depending on the situation, I might use a subgroup for them. Let's say if we have 10 vocals that are all doing the same thing, what I do is I usually add, and this is a good trick that I learned also from Chris Lord-Alge, what I'll do is I add a limiter on all of these individual tracks first, only to limit the very high peaks, just ever so slightly. This will make any subsequent compression work more steadily because I don't get a lot of individual transients poking through from these vocals. Of course, I'll also analyze the tone individually of all of these vocals. So if we have a high, a mid and a low vocal, they might need a little bit of pre-EQing before I send them to the bus. So the high might need a stronger low cut, for instance, just to get rid of all the rumble. The low one might need a bit more cleaning up in the lower mid-range. And the mid-range one might need a low cut and a bit of cleanup, maybe removing some harshness, things like that. But generally I keep it to a minimum, just to make sure that all of these takes sound as clean as possible before going into a group where I then process them together. When I send them together in a group, I usually add 1 compressor to it. Gain reduction as much as I need, usually 5 dB or something like that. Medium attack, fast release, just to keep them nice and steady. And I'll treat them together with effects as well. So reverbs, echoes, all of that kind of stuff will be on the group and not on the individual tracks. Therefore, I have to make sure that the balance between the individual tracks works really well. And of course, the compressor might change some of this. So once I've compressed this group, I'll go back and adjust the volumes of the individual tracks again. In the case of only 2 or 3 separate backing vocals, I will treat them separately because there's no need to make a subgroup. It might just make things complicated down the road. They will all have their individual EQ, compression, and everything else, and I'll send them to effects as needed. I will usually avoid using echoes on backing vocals. Again, I don't want these echoes to interfere with the lead vocal. I'll only use some reverb as much as necessary to make sure that they are behind the lead vocal. Regarding panning, I'll try to keep my backing vocals between, say, 10 and 2, but if it's a lot of them, I'll keep them a lot wider. So this is really genre and situation dependent. You have to check for yourself. I love wide mixes, but I find that backing vocals, if they're panned too wide, they become very distracting. So generally speaking, I try to keep my vocals between maximum 9 to 3 o'clock, something like that. So not quite the widest edge, but nicely panned out in front of you. Hope this helps. Question number 3, low end. This is probably the trickiest subject there is. There are a few things you can do to ensure tight low end. Number 1 is make sure that you have no reverb on your bass instruments. Number 2, make sure that if you want a tight low end, that your instruments that you're using are tight sounding. So this is a very simple thing, but if you want a tight kick, what does tight mean? Tight means it doesn't sustain for ages. So if you want a tight low end, then choose a kick that is nice and short and snappy. The song I'm mixing right now is a really good example for this. Let me show you the kick, how it was and how I mixed it in the end. So here we have the kick. This is the original. As you can hear, it is crazy long. Like, this will just never fit in the mix. It will never be clear. It will never be tight on its own. So what I did was I added these 3 plugins, and what happened is much better. This is what I would call a tight kick. What did I do? Let's have a look. I used a little bit of EQ. I actually boosted a little bit of the 88 Hertz. I used a compressor, but only blended it into 30%, and a channel emulation just to add some color. On its own, this doesn't do too much. It's really just that the EQ boosts a little bit of the attack. Then I picked a transient design, and now here there's a little bit more. I added a little bit more of the attack, and I reduced the sustain a little bit with this one. Let's have a look. This is much better, so you can hear it has a bit more click, it has a bit more punch, it has a little bit less sustain, but it's still a bit too much for my taste. So what I ended up doing was using a noise gate. Look at this. And this way the kick will sit nice and tightly in this mix. Regarding bass instruments, if you're using programmed basses, really just take a preset that sounds good on its own and that needs very little processing. What I noticed in a lot of the mixes that I review is that because of the lack of really good monitoring, people tend to overcompensate and overmix the low end, whereas usually the best thing is to just leave the bass instruments alone. There's not much you have to do, because all of these presets that we're using, all of the software synthesizers, they are really good. You know, Native Instruments, Abbey Road, whatever you're using, they're really good basses. You don't need to process them. You just think you need to process them because your headphones are not representing them accurately, or because you have room modes in your studios, therefore you have no 100 Hertz or 200, whatever, and you tend to over EQ those basses. So let's have a look at what I've done to the sub bass here. Actually, nothing. I just added a sidechain compressor to give the pumping sound, and that's it. But otherwise, I saw in one of the comments that you use saturation and other tricks to make these kind of basses audible. This bass will never be audible in the mid-range, no matter what I do. So just don't even try. But the producer of this song was smart enough to use a sub bass to have the super lows, but he then doubled it up and then used the lead bass to cover the mid-range as well. Let's have a listen. EQ-wise, I just did the same thing. I just boosted a little bit of the presence, but nothing more. And there was a little bit of mud around 200. Unfortunately, the producer added a lot of reverb to this bass. Let's see how he likes it. Let's see how it blends in the end. I might ask him further down the road to send me a dry version of this. Let's see. We only have these 2 instruments that really give the low-end bass for this song, and we have the kick with the punch. So together they sound like this. So to me this is nice and audible, and I didn't do anything. So I think it's more a matter of good production than really good mixing, to be honest. Sometimes what you can do to get a good mix is don't do anything. Don't mess up the good sounds that you have created in your synthesizers or with good guitars, good miking. Yeah, sometimes the best you can do is just don't do anything. And then together, it sounds something like this. As we can hear, there's quite a few instruments, but we can hear the lows really quite well. The kick is punching through. It was all a matter of make sure to emphasize what is good about an instrument and don't over-process things. Another important element in getting tight low end is to make sure that nothing else occupies the bass. So I have here the lead. As you can hear, this lead is really tight, and what I'm doing is I'm cutting at 80 Hz-ish, just to make sure that it doesn't occupy the range that the bass should take care of. The lead instrument, there are no lows, and there's no other instruments. So I think that's another secret. Don't put too many instruments in your production, because if you have too much stuff cluttering up your mix, then they will not be as audible individually. So here we have really the kick, these two basses working together to create the low end, and two separate leads that also kind of work together to give a really aggressive sound. Let's have a listen. Yeah, I hope this helps. This was this week's Q&A. Let me know in the comments below if you have any more questions. I'm happy to answer. Post more questions for next week. We'll do these videos every week. And take it easy. Happy mixing. Bye bye.